Let me give you the punchline first. This is China's last decade. 3 big things. First of all, Chairman Xi has created a cult of personality that is so extreme, and he has shot the messenger literally so many times that no one wants to bring him any information. I mean, this is worse than what's going on with Putin. Putin insists that he is lied to and will get rid of anyone who tells him the truth. No one even wants to approach Chairman Xi because they have no idea what's going on in his head and how whatever fact they give him is going to play to the chorus. He has consolidated more power to himself than any leader in world history. More than Mao, more than the Chinese emperors of old, more than the Kim dynasty in North Korea, more than Donald Trump, more than anyone. And as a result, we're seeing policy collapses across the entire system. The 2 most dramatic, we had power outages that started last March. It's apparent that Xi didn't know they happened until September. We didn't get a policy to deal with it until November, and they're only now getting patched up. And of course, the other one is COVID. Now, we're in Texas. I'm going to assume there's a diversity of opinions on natural immunity versus vaccines. But I think in the quiet of our own homes in the dark, we will admit to ourselves at least that the other side may have a couple of relevant points. Is that fair? In China, neither of these are options. Natural immunity isn't an option because the Chinese have, until now, fairly successfully kept COVID out of the population, so no one has natural immunity. And from the vaccine side, the Chinese vaccines don't work. They worked barely against the original wild strain out of Wuhan. And everyone in China has pretty much got that now. But then we had Alpha and Beta and now Omicron, Delta, ThreatCon, Fuchsia 7, or wherever we are now. And they don't work at all. So if China were to open, you're talking about 2 to 5 million deaths a month for at least 6 months. And in a cult of personality system where the buck literally stops with the top guy, that is a regime-ending event. So lockdowns are their only option. We've got about 90 million Chinese under hard lockdown right now, and about another 250 million under soft lockdown. You can't run a modern economy like that. The Germans are in recession because of energy. I would say that the Chinese would be in recession because of energy if they weren't in recession already because of COVID. So this is going to be the situation until the Chinese can catch up with a better vaccine that is domestically produced, because they've spent the last 2.5 years saying that the American ones make you magnetic and infertile. So they're not going to import them. By the way, if you believe those things, that's Chinese propaganda. If you think they're going to rewrite your DNA, that's Russian propaganda. Next crisis. 3 years ago, the Chinese had an outbreak of something called African swine fever. It's basically Ebola for pigs. Doesn't communicate to humans, thank God, but messy. They say they wiped it out. If you look at a heat map of where cases are in East Asia, all of Chinese borders are raging with ASF, but there's not a single case within China. Yeah, right. In an information-controlled system that is a cult of personality that is having a medical crisis and flirting with an energy crisis, one of the few remaining pillars of legitimacy is food supply. The chances that they're going to lose pork again are pretty high. The last time they had to wipe out 2/3 of their herd. All that's left in that situation is rice. Rice is the most phosphate-demanding crop humans grow. China is the world's largest supplier. They've shut their borders to exports. So just on top of everything with Ukraine, we're also have lost one of the largest things that allow us to keep 8 billion people alive.
China joined the global order with Mao. That was the whole point of the Nixon-Mao summit, that we would bring the Chinese into the system if they would turn their back on the Soviets, and it worked. And that contributed to the end of the Cold War without a shot being fired. Big victory for both sides. Both sides being the US and China, not the Russians, obviously. Now, the Chinese have expanded by a factor of 10 economically. They see themselves as a peer power to the Americans, but they are unwilling to admit that all of the growth that they have had, every little scrap of it, is because of the globalized system that the US maintains. And when the Russians fell under sanction, everything that the Chinese thought was true about their future was laid bare as, at best, wishful thinking and bad analysis. So they are now looking east to the United States and west to the Russians in a little bit of a panic, because they are being tied indirectly to what's going on in Ukraine. And they have now found out not only does the West's, and specifically the United States' financial tools work very well, they now know they would work much better against China than against Russia. because at its core, Russia is a commodities exporter, most notably oil, natural gas, and food. China imports all those things. So if an equivalent sanctions regime was done against the Chinese, you'd have 500 million dead Chinese in less than a year from starvation. And that assumes nothing else gets folded into the situation. So the Chinese are trying to wrestle with the collapse of 50 years of strategic planning and their core ideology as being completely non-functional. I'd say, if you look at the rhetoric from the last 3 weeks, they're doing a decent job of segueing, but you don't rip the mental roots out of an entire system overnight and expect people to just blink and then all of a sudden be on the new scale. Oh, the Europeans have shown that maybe that is a little bit more possible than I'm saying here. But the Chinese have always seen themselves as anti-American. They've always seen themselves as anti-Western, anti-democracy. And now they're realizing that the mood of the man in the White House determines whether their country exists. They're not going to turn on a dime for that. But we'll know soon. I think this is another one of those things that we've shaken out one way or another by the end of April. One other thing. As tight as the sanctions are and as big as they're getting, they're nothing compared to the corporate boycotts. Almost every single company that left Russia was under no legal requirement to do so. They just didn't want to be associated with the war. And we're talking about those ESG, social goody two-shoes, mammoth companies like Exxon and Halliburton, who are now gone, and everyone else followed. So if that happened to China, that's all of their investment that matters. That's all of their technology transfers. That's all of their end markets. This system, if it turned against China, would be far more damning than anything we've seen out of Russia so far.